The stagecoach rattled into Nebraska City, Nebraska, on a blistering August afternoon in 1877, carrying a young woman whose reputation had arrived 3 days before she did, and not in any way that would make a mother proud. Fiona Margaret McKenna stepped down onto the dusty Main Street with her carpetbag clutched tight in one hand and a letter of employment from the Double R Ranch folded in her pocket, knowing full well that half the town was already whispering about the Boston scandal that had sent her fleeing west. She was 22 years old, had never cooked for more than 4 people at once, and had just accepted a position as cook for 15 ranch hands who expected 3 hot meals a day and would likely sooner eat their own boots than whatever she managed to produce. The ranch foreman, a weathered man named Garrett who looked like he had been carved from the same red clay as the Nebraska hills, met her outside the general store with a wagon and an expression that suggested he was already regretting the decision to hire her. He loaded her belongings without a word, and they rode the 6 miles to the ranch in a silence broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional call of a meadowlark. Fiona watched the endless prairie roll past and wondered what madness had possessed her to accept a position so completely outside her abilities. In Boston, she had been a governess, a reader of French poetry, a player of passable piano. The only thing she knew about cooking was that it involved heat and ingredients, and even that knowledge was theoretical at best. The Double R Ranch sprawled across a valley where Willow Creek cut through the grassland, with a main house that had seen better decades, a sprawling bunkhouse, several barns, and a cookhouse that stood separate from everything else, as if the previous inhabitants had wanted to contain any culinary disasters to a single structure. Garrett pulled the wagon up to the cookhouse door and finally spoke. "Meals are at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 at night. Coffee needs to be ready by 5. The hands work hard, and they expect food that sticks to their ribs. Previous cook left 2 weeks ago, and the men have been taking turns, so they will be grateful for anything that does not taste like saddle leather." He paused, then added with what might have been kindness, "At first, anyway." Fiona climbed down from the wagon and surveyed her new kingdom. The cookhouse was a long, low building with a massive cast iron stove that looked like it could heat the entire territory, rough wooden tables that could seat 20, and shelves lined with more pots, pans, and cooking implements than she had ever seen in one place. A pump stood in the corner, a massive wood box sat beside the stove, and through the back door, she could see a root cellar dug into the hillside. It was functional, practical, and utterly terrifying. She spent the rest of the afternoon exploring her supplies and trying to formulate a plan. There were sacks of flour, cornmeal, beans, and potatoes. Slabs of salt pork hung from hooks in the ceiling. Mason jars lined one entire wall, filled with preserved vegetables from the previous summer. She found lard, baking powder, dried herbs she could not identify, and a sourdough starter that bubbled ominously in its crock. By the time the dinner bell needed ringing, she had decided on the simplest possible meal: salt pork, beans, and cornbread. How hard could it be? Very hard, as it turned out. The beans, which she had forgotten to soak, remained stubbornly hard despite an hour of boiling. The salt pork burned on the outside while staying raw in the middle. The cornbread emerged from the oven as a flat, dense disk that could have been used to patch holes in the barn walls. When the ranch hands filed in at 6, their faces sunburned and their clothes coated in dust from a day of mending fences, they took one look at the plates she set before them and fell completely silent. Fiona stood by the stove, her face flushed from heat and humiliation, and watched as 15 men poked at their food with the enthusiasm of men poking at a dead thing they found on the trail. One younger cowboy, who could not have been more than 19, tried to cut the cornbread and had to resort to using his knife like a saw. An older hand with a gray beard picked up a bean, examined it thoughtfully, and set it back down. No one ate. "It is my first day," Fiona said, hating how her voice wavered. "I will improve." "Yes, madam," someone muttered, but it sounded like a prayer without much faith behind it. They eventually managed to choke down enough to avoid outright starvation, but the looks they exchanged spoke volumes. She had seen more enthusiasm at funerals. After they left, Fiona scraped most of the meal into the slop bucket for the hogs, washed the dishes with tears mixing into the wash water, and sat down at the empty table with her head in her hands. She could go back to Boston and face the scandal, or she could learn to cook. Neither option seemed particularly appealing, but at least in Nebraska, no one was gossiping about how she had rejected the wrong man's marriage proposal and found herself suddenly unemployable in every respectable household in Massachusetts. The next morning she woke at 4:30, lit the lamps in the pre-dawn darkness, and started the coffee. At least she could not ruin coffee, or so she thought until she made it so strong that the foreman took one sip and his eyebrows disappeared into his hairline. Breakfast was eggs that were somehow both runny and rubbery, bacon that crumbled into charcoal, and biscuits that could have been used as ammunition. The hands ate in grim silence, fueled more by necessity than enjoyment. By Tuesday, the situation had not improved. Fiona tried to make stew and produce something that looked like dishwater with chunks of regret floating in it. Her pie crust was tough enough to sole a boot. Her gravy had lumps the size of walnuts. The ranch hands began arriving at meals with the resignation of men marching to their doom, and she heard them discussing in low voices whether it might be possible to hire someone else, anyone else, even if they had to pay out of their own wages. Wednesday brought pot roast that was so dry it could have absorbed the entire contents of Willow Creek, accompanied by potatoes that were somehow burned and undercooked simultaneously, a feat that should have been physically impossible. She saw two of the hands trying to trade their meals to the ranch dogs, but even the dogs turned up their noses. Fiona went to bed that night convinced she would be dismissed by morning. It was Thursday morning when everything changed, though she did not realize it at the time. She was standing at the stove, on the verge of tears, trying to figure out why her pancakes kept turning into blackened discs of disappointment, when a voice spoke from behind her. "You are cooking them on heat that is too high, and you are not waiting for the bubbles to form before you flip them." Fiona spun around to find one of the ranch hands standing in the doorway. She had noticed him before because he was difficult not to notice. Lucas Finnegan was 26 years old, with dark hair that perpetually fell across his forehead, gray eyes the color of storm clouds, and a quiet intensity that made her nervous in a way she could not quite name. He worked harder than any two men combined, never spoke unless he had something worth saying, and had been watching her culinary disasters with an expression she could not read. "I beg your pardon," she said, bristling despite herself. "The griddle," he said, moving closer. He was tall, with broad shoulders and hands that looked like they could break a horse or gentle a newborn calf with equal skill. "It is too hot, and you are flipping them too soon. Watch the surface. When bubbles form and pop, leaving little holes, that is when you flip." He took the spatula from her hand, their fingers brushing for just a moment, and demonstrated. She watched, fascinated despite her wounded pride, as he poured a ladleful of batter onto the griddle at a lower temperature. Bubbles formed across the surface like tiny craters. He waited until they popped, then flipped the pancake in one smooth motion. When he transferred it to a plate, it was golden brown and perfect. "How do you know how to do this?" she asked. "My mother taught me before she died," he said simply. "I was 12. My father could not cook worth a damn, so I learned, or we would have starved." He handed the spatula back to her. "Try again. Lower heat. Wait for the bubbles." She did, and while her pancakes were not as perfect as his, they were edible. The ranch hands noticed the improvement immediately, and while no one said anything, she saw Lucas give her a small nod across the room, and something in her chest grew a little lighter. After breakfast, she found him waiting by the cookhouse door. "If you want, I can come by before dinner and show you a few more things," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "The men are getting hungry enough to consider mutiny, and I would hate to see them run off a woman who is at least trying." "I am trying very hard," Fiona said, and was horrified to feel tears prickling at her eyes again. "I just do not know what I am doing." "That is obvious," Lucas said, but there was no cruelty in his voice, just honesty. "But everyone has to learn somewhere. Might as well be here, where the worst that can happen is some cowboys go hungry for a bit. They will survive." So that Thursday evening, Lucas came to the cookhouse an hour before dinner and taught her how to properly season a pan, how to tell when oil was hot enough for frying, how to test meat for doneness by pressing it with her finger. He showed her how to make gravy without lumps, how to roll out pie dough without overworking it, how to tell when bread had been kneaded enough. His hands were patient, his voice calm, and he never once made her feel stupid, even though they both knew she was desperately out of her depth. Dinner that night was better. Not good exactly, but better. The chicken was cooked through without being dry, the vegetables were tender, and the gravy was lumpy but edible. One of the younger hands, a lanky boy named Pete, actually reached for seconds of the potatoes, then seemed surprised by his own action. Friday morning, Lucas appeared again at 5, just as Fiona was starting breakfast. "Thought you might need help with the biscuits," he said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He showed her how to cut the cold lard into the flour until it resembled coarse crumbs, how to add just enough buttermilk to bring the dough together, how to pat it out gently instead of rolling it. "You have been handling it like you are angry at it," he said, his mouth quirking up just slightly at the corner. "Biscuit dough needs a tender hand." "I have been angry at everything this week," Fiona admitted. "Mostly at myself." "Reasonable," Lucas said. "But the dough did not do anything to you, so be kind to it." His hands covered hers, guiding them to fold the dough gently over itself, and she was suddenly very aware of how close he was standing, of the warmth radiating from him, of the scent of leather and sage that clung to his clothes. She looked up and found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Like this," she managed to say. "Exactly like that," he said, his voice rougher than before, and stepped back quickly. The biscuits came out of the oven tall and fluffy, golden brown on top, and when she split one open, steam rose from its tender interior. The ranch hands stared at them like they were witnessing a miracle. The foreman took a bite, chewed slowly, and said, "Well, I will be damned." By lunch, word had apparently spread because the hands showed up early, shuffling into the cookhouse with expressions of cautious hope. Fiona had made beef stew under Lucas's supervision, learning how to brown the meat properly first, how to build layers of flavor, how to time the vegetables so everything finished cooking together. Lucas had slipped away before the meal was served, but she could see him through the window, watching from his spot by the corral. The hands ate. And then, for the first time since she had arrived, they went back for more. Pete got into a brief shoving match with another cowboy over the last ladle of stew. The foreman had 3 bowls and looked like he was considering a 4th. When they finally left, there was not a drop remaining in the pot, and Fiona stood in the empty cookhouse feeling something she had not felt in weeks: pride. Lucas came by after dinner, ostensibly to return a book he had borrowed from the main house, but really, she suspected, to see how the meal had gone. "I heard there was nearly a fight over seconds," he said, leaning against the doorframe. "There was some enthusiastic competition," Fiona agreed, scrubbing a pot at the sink. "All thanks to you. I do not know how to repay you for your help." "No repayment needed," Lucas said. "I just did not want to keep eating burned bacon." She laughed, and he smiled properly for the first time since she had met him, and she realized with a start that he was handsome when he smiled, in a way that made her heart do complicated things in her chest. "Will you teach me more?" she asked. "I have managed to avoid complete disaster for one day, but I have no idea what I am doing for the rest of the week." "I suppose I could," Lucas said, as if he were considering a great burden. "Someone has to make sure we do not all starve." So it became their routine. Every morning and evening, Lucas would appear in the cookhouse and teach her another skill, another recipe, another secret of the kitchen. He taught her how to make sourdough bread that rose properly, how to fry chicken until the crust was crispy and the meat was juicy, how to roast a joint of beef so it was pink and tender in the middle. He taught her how to make dried apple pie, vinegar slaw, baked beans with molasses, cornbread that was fluffy instead of dense. He was patient when she made mistakes, encouraging when she got discouraged, and his quiet presence became the part of her day she looked forward to most. As the days passed, their conversations expanded beyond cooking. She learned that Lucas had grown up in Missouri, that he had been working as a cowboy since he was 15, that he had a younger sister married to a shopkeeper in Omaha. He learned that Fiona had been a governess, that she loved books more than was probably reasonable, that she had come west to escape a scandal that involved a wealthy man's son, a refused proposal, and accusations that she had led him on. "Did you?" Lucas asked one evening as they rolled out pasta dough together, their hands working in comfortable synchronization. "Lead him on, I mean." "No," Fiona said firmly. "I was polite, I was friendly, I did my job." But he decided that meant I owed him affection, and when I made it clear I did not share his feelings, he told everyone I had encouraged him, and then rejected him to increase my own value. By the time the rumors finished spreading, I was either a heartless temptress or a calculating fortune hunter, depending on who you asked. His mother dismissed me, and suddenly no one else would hire me either. "That is not fair," Lucas said, his jaw tight. "No," Fiona agreed. "But very little in this world is fair, particularly for women. So here I am, learning to make pasta in Nebraska because it was this or go back and beg his forgiveness, and I would rather die." "I am glad you chose Nebraska," Lucas said quietly, and something in his tone made her look up. He was watching her with those storm-gray eyes, and the air between them felt suddenly charged, like the moment before lightning strikes. "I am beginning to be glad too," Fiona said, her voice barely above a whisper. The Sunday of her second week at the ranch, Lucas asked if she would like to ride out to Willow Creek after breakfast was cleaned up. "There is a spot where the cottonwoods grow thick," he said. "It is cooler there and quiet. I thought you might like to get away from the cookhouse for a few hours." Fiona had not ridden in years, but she found herself saying yes before she had time to reconsider. He saddled a gentle mare named Clover for her and his own horse, a rangy bay gelding named Jack, and they rode out across the prairie under a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The grass rolled away in every direction, broken only by the occasional stand of trees or outcropping of rock. Hawks circled overhead, and meadowlarks sang from the fence posts. The spot Lucas had mentioned was a small oasis of green, where the creek widened into a pool and massive cottonwoods cast dappled shade across the water. They dismounted and sat on the bank, and Fiona pulled off her boots and dangled her feet in the water, gasping at how cold it was despite the heat of the day. "This is beautiful," she said. "Thank you for bringing me here." "I come here when I need to think," Lucas said. He had taken off his hat, and his dark hair ruffled in the breeze. "It is the one place on the ranch where you can hear yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the water and the wind in the trees. Then Lucas said, "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you regret coming here? I know it has been hard. I know you did not ask to be a cook." Fiona considered the question carefully. 2 weeks ago, she would have said yes without hesitation. But now, sitting beside this quiet man who had shown her more kindness than anyone in Boston ever had, watching the sunlight dance on the water, she found the answer was not so simple. "I regret the circumstances that brought me here," she said finally. "But I do not regret being here. Not anymore." Lucas turned to look at her, and she met his gaze steadily. "I am glad," he said. "I was worried you might give up and go back east. I would have missed you." "You barely know me," Fiona said, but her heart was racing. "I know you keep trying even when things are hard," Lucas said. "I know you are smart and funny, and you listen when people teach you things. I know you bite your lower lip when you are concentrating, and you have a temper when something does not work the way you expect, and you sing to yourself when you think no one is listening." He paused, then added, "I know I think about you far more than is probably appropriate for a ranch hand to think about the cook." Fiona felt heat flood her cheeks that had nothing to do with the sun. "Lucas, I should not have said that," he said quickly. "I apologize. I did not mean to make you uncomfortable." "You did not," Fiona said. She took a breath, gathering her courage. "I think about you too, more than I should, more than is wise, probably." The smile that spread across Lucas's face was like sunrise, slow and warm and illuminating. "That is good," he said. "That is very good." He reached out and took her hand, and they sat there by the creek, fingers intertwined while the cottonwoods whispered overhead and the world felt suddenly full of possibility. The following weeks fell into a rhythm that felt almost like happiness. Fiona's cooking continued to improve, and the ranch hands went from merely accepting her meals to genuinely enjoying them. She learned how to manage the sourdough starter, how to smoke meat, how to make preserves from wild plums. Lucas continued to help her, though now his presence in the cookhouse had taken on a different quality. Their hands would brush when passing ingredients. Their eyes would meet across the room, and sometimes, when no one else was around, he would stand behind her and guide her hands through a new technique, and she would lean back into his warmth without thinking about it. They went riding on Sundays, exploring the ranch and the surrounding prairie. Lucas showed her where to find wild strawberries, how to identify edible plants, how to read the weather in the clouds. She told him about books she loved, about her childhood in Maine before her parents died, about her dreams of seeing the ocean again someday. They talked about everything and nothing, and every conversation left her wanting more. In September, a warm spell brought Indian summer to Nebraska, and the ranch hands decided to celebrate with a dance in town. Lucas, who had been notably quiet all day, finally approached Fiona while she was kneading bread. "Will you go with me?" he asked. "To the dance, I mean, as my guest." Fiona looked up at him, this strong, quiet man who had taught her so much more than cooking, and felt her heart swell with affection. "I would like that very much." The dance was held in the town hall, with lanterns strung from the rafters and a fiddle player who could make his instrument sing. Lucas cleaned up well, she discovered, in a pressed shirt and a string tie, his dark hair combed back and his boots polished. He offered her his arm, and they walked in together under the eyes of the entire town, making a statement that everyone understood. Lucas was a better dancer than she expected, guiding her through reels and waltzes with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. His hand was warm on her waist, and when they turned, she could feel the strength in him, carefully controlled. Other couples swirled around them, but Fiona was only aware of Lucas, of the way he looked at her like she was something precious, of how perfectly she seemed to fit against him. During a break in the music, they stepped outside for air, and Lucas led her around to the side of the building, where shadows pooled thick and the noise from the dance was muffled. "Fiona," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth, like something sacred. "I need to tell you something." "All right," she said, her pulse quickening. "I am falling in love with you," Lucas said. "Maybe I have been since the moment you made those first terrible biscuits and looked so heartbroken that I could not stand it. I know I am just a cowboy. I do not have much to offer. But I am hardworking and I am honest, and I would spend every day trying to make you happy if you would let me." Fiona felt tears sting her eyes, but they were good tears, joyful tears. "Lucas Finnegan, you are not just anything. You are kind and patient, and you taught me to cook when you absolutely did not have to. You listened to me and saw me and made me feel like I mattered. I am falling in love with you too. I think I have been for weeks." The kiss, when it came, was sweet and searching, a question and an answer all at once. Lucas cupped her face in his calloused hands like she was made of porcelain, and she rose up on her toes to meet him, her arms winding around his neck. It was her first real kiss, the one she had refused to give the Boston banker's son, the one she had been saving without quite knowing it for someone who deserved it. Lucas kissed her like she was air after drowning, like she was rain after drought, and when they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. "I do not want to rush you," Lucas said, resting his forehead against hers. "We can take this slow. I just needed you to know how I feel." "I know now," Fiona said, smiling, "and I am very glad you told me." They returned to the dance, but everything had changed. Now, when Lucas held her, it was with the freedom of declared affection. Now, when she smiled at him, it was with the knowledge that he loved her, and she loved him, and that was a fact as solid as the ground beneath their feet. October brought cooler weather and the hard work of preparing the ranch for winter. The hands repaired fences, moved cattle to lower pastures, and stocked the barns with hay. Fiona spent long days preserving food, making sure they would have enough to last through the cold months. Lucas helped her whenever he could, and their courtship continued in stolen moments. A quick kiss in the root cellar, holding hands while walking back from the barn, sitting together on the cookhouse steps watching the stars wheel overhead. The foreman, Garrett, pulled Lucas aside one day and said, "Are your intentions toward Miss McKenna honorable?" "Completely," Lucas said without hesitation. "I plan to marry her if she will have me." "Good," Garrett said. "She is a fine woman and she has worked hard here. You treat her right, or you will answer to me and to every other man on this ranch." It was the blessing Lucas had not known he needed, and it made what he planned to do next feel possible. On a Sunday in late October, Lucas took Fiona riding again, this time to a high point overlooking the ranch. The autumn colors were past their peak, but still beautiful, golds and reds and browns spreading across the landscape like a quilt. They dismounted and stood looking out over the valley, and Lucas took both her hands in his. "Fiona Margaret McKenna," he said, his voice steady despite the nerve she could see in his eyes. "I know we have not known each other long. It has only been 3 months, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life. You are smart and brave and beautiful, and you make me want to be a better man. I do not have a fancy ring yet, but I will get you one, I promise. Will you marry me?" Fiona felt joy bubble up inside her like champagne. "Yes," she said, laughing and crying at the same time. "Yes, Lucas, I will marry you. I do not need a fancy ring. I just need you." He swept her up and spun her around, both of them laughing, and then he was kissing her again, deeper this time, with the promise of a shared future in every touch. When they finally pulled apart, Fiona said, "We should tell the others." "They already know," Lucas said, grinning. "Garrett asked me if my intentions were honorable. I told him I was going to marry you. I suspect the whole ranch knows by now." He was right. When they rode back to the ranch, they were met with cheers and congratulations. The hands insisted on a celebration, and that night, Fiona cooked a feast, the best meal she had ever made, and everyone ate until they could not hold another bite. Garrett made a speech about how they had all thought they were doomed when Fiona first arrived, but now they were the best-fed cowboys in Nebraska. And if Lucas did not marry her quick, someone else might try to steal her away. Pete, the young hand who had been the first to go for seconds that magical Friday, gave them a set of hand-carved spoons as an engagement gift, which made Fiona tear up all over again. They married in November, in a simple ceremony at the church in Nebraska City, with all the ranch hands in attendance. Fiona wore a dress she had made herself from blue calico, and Lucas wore a new suit that he had saved 3 months' wages to buy. The minister pronounced them husband and wife, and when Lucas kissed her, the cowboys cheered so loudly that the rafters shook. The ranch owner, Mr. Roberts, who had been away on business and had missed the drama of Fiona's arrival and transformation, returned just in time for the wedding. He was a gruff man in his 60s who had built the double R from nothing, and he listened to the whole story over dinner that night. "So let me make sure I understand this correctly," he said. "You hired a cook who could not cook. She nearly starved my men, and then Lucas here taught her everything he knew, and now we have the best food in 3 counties. That about sums it up," Garrett said. Mr. Roberts looked at Fiona and Lucas, who were sitting close together, Lucas's arm around his bride's shoulders. "Well," he said finally, "I suppose that worked out better than it had any right to. As a wedding present, I am giving you the old foreman's cabin. It needs fixing up, but it has got 2 rooms and a good roof, and it is yours for as long as you work here." The cabin sat on the far side of the ranch, near a stand of cottonwoods that reminded Fiona of the spot where she and Lucas had first acknowledged their feelings. They spent their first winter as husband and wife fixing it up, making it a home. Lucas built furniture, and Fiona sewed curtains and made braided rugs. They acquired 2 chickens, a cat to keep the mice at bay, and a sense of contentment that neither had expected to find. Fiona continued cooking for the ranch hands, but now Lucas worked alongside her every morning and evening, and their partnership in the kitchen mirrored their partnership in life. They moved together with the ease of people who understood each other, anticipating needs before they were spoken, communicating with glances and small gestures. The hands ate well and complained rarely, and on Fridays, there were still occasional good-natured fights over seconds, particularly when Fiona made her apple pie or Lucas's mother's stew recipe. In the spring, Fiona discovered she was pregnant. She told Lucas one morning while they were making breakfast, and he picked her up and spun her around just like he had the day she accepted his proposal, his face lit with joy. She gave birth in December, during the first snowstorm of the winter, to a healthy baby boy they named James Lucas Finnegan. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's stubborn determination, and he was the most beautiful thing either of them had ever seen. Fiona took a month away from cooking to recover and care for baby James, and during that time, Lucas managed the kitchen himself, feeding the hands the recipes he and Fiona had perfected together. The men grumbled about missing Fiona's cooking, but they admitted that Lucas held his own, and they were all impatient for her to return. When she did, with James bundled in a sling against her chest, they greeted her like a returning queen. The years that followed were good ones, the kind that are made of small, ordinary joys rather than grand dramas. Fiona and Lucas welcomed 2 more children, a daughter named Mary Catherine in 1881 and another son, Robert William, in 1883. The cabin expanded to accommodate the growing family, with Lucas adding rooms and a wide front porch where they would sit in the evenings, watching the children play. Lucas was promoted to foreman when Garrett retired in 1885, and with the promotion came greater responsibility and a small increase in wages. They saved carefully, talking sometimes about buying their own land someday, starting their own ranch. It was a dream that felt possible, which was more than either of them had expected when they first met. The ranch hands changed over the years as men moved on to other opportunities or settled into families of their own, but the tradition of Fiona's cooking remained constant. New cowboys would arrive and hear the story of how she had nearly poisoned everyone her first week, and how she and Lucas had fallen in love over bread dough and beef stew. They would express polite skepticism until Friday rolled around and they found themselves fighting for seconds of her fried chicken or roast pork, and then they would become believers. Pete, the young cowboy who had been the first to go for seconds, eventually married a girl from town and bought a small homestead north of the ranch. He and his wife would visit sometimes, and Pete never failed to mention that he had known from the start that Fiona would be an excellent cook, a claim that made everyone who had been there roll their eyes and call him a liar, but always with affection. In 1890, when James was 8, Mary was 7, and Robert was 5, an opportunity arose that Lucas and Fiona had been waiting for. A ranch adjacent to the Double R came up for sale when its owner decided to retire to California. It was smaller than the Double R, only a few hundred acres, but it had good water, decent grazing, and a house that needed work but had good bones. Mr. Roberts, who had grown fond of Lucas and Fiona over the years, offered to loan them part of the purchase price at a fair rate, and they used their savings for the rest. The decision to leave the Double R was bittersweet. It had been their home for 13 years, the place where they had met and fallen in love, where their children had been born. But it was time to build something of their own. The ranch hands threw them a farewell party that lasted until dawn, with music and dancing and enough food to feed twice their number. Garrett, long retired but still hale, made a speech about how Lucas was the best foreman he had ever worked with, and Fiona was the finest cook Nebraska had ever seen, and how the Double R would not be the same without them. They moved to their new ranch, which they called the Cottonwood, in the spring of 1890. The first year was hard, filled with long days and constant work as they built up their herd and made necessary improvements to the property. But they faced it together, as they had faced everything since that long-ago August, when Lucas had taught Fiona to make pancakes. Their children grew strong and capable, learning to ride and rope and handle cattle, and also how to cook, because both Lucas and Fiona believed that everyone should know how to feed themselves. They hired 3 hands to help with the work, and Fiona cooked for them just as she had at the Double R. 2 of the hands were experienced cowboys, but the third was a young man fresh from the city who had never worked cattle before. Watching Lucas teach him reminded Fiona of her own early days of incompetence and patience, and it made her smile. Some things, she realized, came full circle. In 1895, Mr. Roberts passed away and left Lucas a small bequest in his will, along with a letter that said he had never been more proud of an investment than when he had taken a chance on hiring a governess to be a cook. The money allowed Lucas and Fiona to make additional improvements to the cottonwood, including a larger barn and a proper bunkhouse for the hands. James grew into a young man who was the image of his father, quiet and steady and good with horses. Mary inherited her mother's sharp mind and love of books, and spent her free time reading everything she could get her hands on. Robert was the wild one, always climbing things he should not climb and coming home covered in mud and mischief. Fiona loved them all with a fierceness that sometimes took her breath away. On a Sunday in August of 1898, exactly 21 years after Fiona had first arrived in Nebraska City, Lucas suggested they ride out to the spot by Willow Creek, where he had first told her he loved her. They had not been there in years, too busy with the work of running a ranch and raising children, but the cottonwoods still stood, and the creek still ran cold and clear. They sat on the bank, just as they had 2 decades earlier, and Fiona took off her boots and dangled her feet in the water, gasping at the cold. Lucas laughed, and she splashed him, and for a moment they were young again, newly in love, with the whole future spread before them like the prairie. "Do you ever regret it?" Lucas asked. "Staying here, I mean. You could have gone back to Boston, found some other way to make a life." Fiona turned to look at him, at this man she had built a life with, who had taught her to cook and to love, who had given her 3 beautiful children and more happiness than she had ever thought possible. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This is exactly where I am supposed to be." Lucas took her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers, and they sat in the dappled shade of the cottonwoods, listening to the water and feeling grateful for a path that had brought them together against all odds. The years continued to roll past like the prairie grass in the wind. James met a rancher's daughter at a dance in town, and courted her with the same quiet determination his father had shown, and they married in 1902 in a ceremony that filled the church to bursting. Mary went to school in Omaha and became a teacher, returning to Nebraska City to educate the next generation of children, though she still came home every Sunday for dinner. Robert tried his hand at several ventures, from cowboying to working on the railroad, before finally settling down to help his parents run the cottonwood. Lucas and Fiona grew older together, their hair turning gray, their hands growing weathered from years of work. But the essential things remained unchanged. Lucas still made Fiona laugh. Fiona still sang to herself when she cooked. They still held hands when they walked, still stole kisses when they thought no one was looking, still looked at each other with the kind of love that made their children roll their eyes and smile at the same time. In 1910, James and his wife gave them their first grandchild, a baby girl they named Fiona in honor of her grandmother. When Fiona held that tiny, perfect baby, she thought about the scared young woman who had stepped off the stagecoach 33 years earlier, who had burned everything she touched and been so certain she would fail. She thought about Lucas, who had been kind when he did not have to be, who had taught her and loved her and built a life with her. She thought about all the meals she had cooked, all the hands she had fed, all the Friday nights when the Cowboys had fought over seconds of her pie. "What are you thinking about?" Lucas asked, coming to stand beside her, looking down at his granddaughter with wonder. "Everything," Fiona said. "How we got here, how lucky I am." "I am the lucky one," Lucas said, putting his arm around her. "I got to watch you learn to make the perfect biscuit." Not many men can say that. Fiona laughed and leaned into him, this man who had been her partner, her teacher, her best friend, and her great love. "We both got lucky," she said. "That day you taught me to make pancakes changed everything." "No," Lucas said, kissing the top of her head. "You changed everything. You just needed someone to show you how to hold the spatula." As the sun set over the Cottonwood Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, 3 generations of Finnegans gathered for Sunday dinner. The table was laden with food, all of it cooked by Fiona with occasional help from Lucas, who still sometimes stood behind her at the stove and guided her hands, even though she was now one of the best cooks in the county and had been for decades. The children and grandchildren ate with enthusiasm, and there were the usual good-natured arguments over who got the last piece of pie. After the meal, as the family sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Mary asked her mother to tell the story again, the one about how she had nearly starved all the cowboys her first week at the Double R, and how their father had saved the day. It was a family legend by now, told and retold at gatherings, but it never got old. Fiona smiled and began the tale, with Lucas occasionally interjecting corrections or additions. She told them about the burned biscuits and the hard beans, about the funeral silence at those first meals, about the day Lucas had appeared in the cookhouse and taught her to make pancakes. She told them about falling in love over bread dough and stew pots, about the first Friday when the hands had fought over seconds, about the moment she knew that Nebraska was her home and Lucas was her heart. "And that," she finished, "is how a woman who could not cook to save her life became a ranch wife and a mother and, eventually, the grandmother of the most beautiful baby girl in Nebraska." Little Fiona, now sleeping peacefully in her father's arms, seemed to agree with this assessment. James looked at his parents at the way they still sat close together, hands intertwined, and said, "I hope my marriage is half as good as yours." "It will be if you work at it," Lucas said. "Love is like cooking. It takes practice and patience, and sometimes you burn things. But if you keep trying and if you have the right partner, you can make something wonderful." "That is the most romantic thing I have ever heard you say," Fiona said, smiling at him. "I have been saving it," Lucas said, and kissed her while their children groaned and laughed. The years rolled on, as years do, bringing both joy and sorrow. Fiona and Lucas celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1917 with a party that brought together everyone whose lives they had touched. Former ranch hands came from as far as Montana and Texas to celebrate the couple who had fed them and shown them what a good marriage looked like. The current hands at the Cottonwood insisted on cooking the meal themselves, as a way of honoring Fiona, and while the food was good, everyone agreed it was not quite as good as hers. Mary married a banker from Omaha, and Robert eventually wed a widow with 2 children of her own, expanding the Finnegan clan. More grandchildren arrived, filling the ranch house with noise and laughter and the kind of chaos that Fiona had once feared but now embraced wholeheartedly. She taught her granddaughters to cook, passing on the skills that Lucas had taught her, and the tradition of the Friday fights over seconds continued into the next generation. In 1920, Nebraska gave women the right to vote, and Fiona cast her first ballot with pride, thinking about how far she had come from the scared young woman who had fled Boston. She voted for candidates who supported farmers and ranchers, who understood the challenges of rural life, and when she came home from the polling place, Lucas had made dinner for her, a perfect beef stew that tasted just like the first one he had taught her to make all those years ago. They grew old together, their bodies wearing out in the way that bodies do after decades of hard work and good living. Lucas's hands, which had taught Fiona to cook and held her through 3 childbirths and built a ranch from nothing, grew stiff with arthritis. Fiona's eyes, which had once read French poetry and watched her children grow and seen the sunrise over the prairie thousands of times, grew dim. But their love remained bright and constant, a fire that warmed everyone around them. On a summer evening in 1925, they sat together on the porch of the Cottonwood Ranch, watching the sun set over land they had worked for 35 years. They were in their 70s now, and their children kept suggesting they should slow down, should let James and Robert take over more of the ranch work, should rest. But neither of them was ready to stop yet. There was still too much to do, too much to see, too much life left to live. "Do you remember the first time I kissed you?" Lucas asked, his voice rougher with age but still warm. "Behind the town hall during the dance," Fiona said. "You told me you were falling in love with me, and I told you I was falling in love with you too." "Best night of my life," Lucas said. "Well, second best. The best was when you married me." "Only second best," Fiona teased. "What about when our children were born?" "Those were good too," Lucas allowed. "But nothing compared to the moment you said yes, you would be my wife. Everything good in my life came from that moment." Fiona took his hand and raised it to her lips, kissing the gnarled knuckles. "Everything good in my life came from the day you taught me to make pancakes. I was so lost, Lucas. I did not know who I was or what I was supposed to do. And you were patient with me. You saw something in me worth saving." "I saw a woman who was trying her best in a hard situation," Lucas said. "I saw someone brave and stubborn and determined not to quit, even when everything seemed impossible. I saw you, Fiona. I always saw you." They sat in silence for a while, holding hands and watching the stars emerge one by one. Somewhere in the house behind them, they could hear their grandchildren laughing, and the smell of dinner cooking drifted out through the open windows. Life continued, as it always did, in an endless cycle of meals and work and love. "I am glad I burned those first biscuits," Fiona said suddenly. "If I had been a good cook from the start, you might never have come to help me." "I would have found another excuse," Lucas said. "I was looking for reasons to talk to you from the moment you arrived. You were so determined and fierce and completely out of your depth, I could not help but be charmed." "I was terrified," Fiona admitted, "every single day. I kept waiting for someone to realize I did not belong there, to send me back to Boston in disgrace." "But you did belong there," Lucas said. "You belong here. You always have. This is your home and I am your family, and nothing that happened in Boston matters anymore. It has not mattered for almost 50 years. Fiona leaned her head on his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her, and they sat together as the Nebraska night deepened around them. Tomorrow there would be work to do, meals to cook, grandchildren to spoil, a ranch to run. But tonight, there was just this. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, who had built a life together from scratch, who had loved each other through good times and hard times, who had made a home in the Wild West and filled it with laughter and food and family. Inside the house, Mary called that dinner was ready. Lucas and Fiona rose slowly, their joints protesting, and walked hand in hand into the warmth and light and noise of their family. The table was crowded with children and grandchildren, and the meal was one that Fiona had taught them all to make. Pot roast with vegetables, fresh bread, apple pie for dessert. As they ate, the youngest grandson asked about the story of how Grandpa had taught Grandma to cook, and Fiona exchanged a smile with Lucas across the table. They had told this story 100 times, maybe 1,000, but it never got old. It was their story, the foundation on which everything else was built. "Well," Fiona began. "It started on a Monday morning in August of 1877 when I arrived in Nebraska City and had absolutely no idea what I was doing." Lucas picked up the thread, describing the first terrible meals, the cowboy's dismay, the moment he decided he had to intervene or they would all starve. The grandchildren listened with rapt attention, even though they had heard it all before. It was a good story, a love story, one that had happened right here in this place, in this family. When the story finished with Lucas proposing on the hilltop, the grandchildren sighed with satisfaction, and the adults smiled, and someone suggested it was time for pie. As the dessert was served and seconds were requested, and the familiar Friday tradition played out one more time, Fiona looked around the table at the life she and Lucas had created. 3 children, 8 grandchildren, a ranch that had prospered under their stewardship, a community that respected them, and 48 years of marriage that had been built on a foundation of patience, teaching, and a willingness to see the best in each other. It had started with burned biscuits and terrible coffee, but it had become something beautiful, something lasting, something real. That night, as they prepared for bed in the room they had shared for decades, Lucas said, "I love you, Fiona Finnegan. I have loved you since you were Fiona McKenna, standing at that stove looking like you wanted to cry, and I will love you until the day I die." "I love you too," Fiona said, kissing him softly. "Thank you for teaching me to cook. Thank you for teaching me everything." "It was my pleasure," Lucas said, and meant it with every fiber of his being. They lived several more good years, seeing James's children grow up and start families of their own, watching the Cottonwood Ranch thrive under the next generation's care, cooking together in the kitchen where they had shared so many moments. Lucas passed away peacefully in his sleep in the winter of 1930, at the age of 79, and Fiona followed him 6 months later, as if she could not bear to be without him for long. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the Cottonwood Ranch, under cottonwood trees that rustled in the wind like whispers. Their gravestone was simple, bearing their names, their dates, and a single line. They taught each other everything. It was exactly right. The ranch continued, passed down through the generations, and with it came the stories. The story of the governess from Boston who could not cook but learned. The story of the cowboy who taught her and fell in love with her. The story of the Friday when the hands first fought over seconds, and everyone knew that things were going to be all right. The story of a love built in a kitchen, strengthened by patience, and sustained over a lifetime. Every Friday, when the family gathered for dinner at the Cottonwood Ranch, there would be good food and laughter and, inevitably, someone fighting over seconds. And the current generation would tell their children about Lucas and Fiona, about how love sometimes started in the most unexpected places, about how the best things in life were worth working for, and about how a little patience and kindness could change everything. The legacy they left was not just a ranch or a family, though both were considerable. It was the understanding that love was like cooking. It required attention, practice, and the willingness to keep trying even when you failed. It meant being patient with yourself and with others. It meant showing up every day and doing the work, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. It meant finding joy in small things, like a perfectly risen biscuit or a hand held across a table. And it meant that sometimes the worst first week imaginable could lead to the best life possible, as long as you had someone willing to teach you, willing to see your potential, willing to love you not despite your flaws but with full knowledge of them. Lucas had seen Fiona's determination beneath her incompetence, and she had seen his kindness beneath his rough exterior. And together, they had made something that lasted long after they were gone. The story of the Cottonwood Ranch of Lucas and Fiona Finnegan lived on in every family meal, in every lesson passed from grandmother to granddaughter, in every moment when someone took the time to teach rather than judge, to help rather than criticize. It lived on in the understanding that everyone started somewhere, that failure was just another word for learning, and that the best partnerships were built on mutual respect, patience, and a whole lot of love. The Wild West that Lucas and Fiona had known changed over the decades, becoming more civilized, more settled, less wild. But some things remained constant. The need for good food, the value of hard work, the power of love, and the understanding that sometimes the best things in life came from the most unlikely beginnings. A governess who could not cook and a cowboy who could become the foundation of a family that would last for generations. All because he took the time to teach her how to make pancakes, and she had the courage to keep trying. And every Friday, somewhere in Nebraska, someone fought over seconds at dinner, carrying on a tradition that had started on a magical Friday in August of 1877. When a scared young woman's cooking finally became good enough that hungry cowboys wanted more. That was the moment everything changed, the moment when failure transformed into success, when hopelessness became hope, when teaching became love. That was the moment the story really began, and it was a story that would never truly end, because love, like good cooking, lasted. It filled people up. It brought them together. It made life worth living, and that was the greatest legacy anyone could leave behind.